interviewer will ask, do you have any questions for me? And a lot of times people will go, nope. And I think that is a recipe for disaster. So what is your advice when someone says, hey, what are your questions for me?
Absolutely. As we talked about in advance, the planning that we do, we research the company, we create our themes, we stockpile or create examples that support our themes. You should also be thinking about, what do you want to know about this job? And the questions you ask when an interviewer says, do you have any questions for me, demonstrate so much about yourself. This is actually part of the interview. The quality of the question you ask shows what you've learned about the company and what type of person you are. So have some questions at the ready. I think it's very hollow and empty when you say, nope, no questions. I think it's very important to have some. I personally have a favorite question that I like to ask. And Andrew, I'd like to role play this if it's okay, because it's hard for me to do both parts of this. So imagine Andrew and I are still doing that interview to see if I should be the lecturer at Stanford where I am. And the interview's over, Andrew. And would you ask me if I have any questions for you?
Of course, Matt. Do you have any questions for me about working here?
Andrew, thank you for the interview. A big question I have is, what question do you wish you would have asked when you were being hired in for your job? I love this question because it brings out so much insight, and it shows that you're somebody who's really curious about how the company really works. And I have learned so many interesting things from this. Sometimes it's very practical. Somebody says, well, I really wish when I got hired, I would have signed up for this particular insurance coverage. But other times it's like, people will give me insights into the inner workings of the company. They'll say, well, I really wish I would have known how the difference between the product team and the engineering team has some issues. And then I follow up. I'll say, oh, so in this role, how would I be able to help with that? So asking a question that gets your interviewer to share insight into the company or their perspective can be really helpful for you. And by the way, this is a little trick in small talk. A lot of us are uncomfortable making small talk chit chat. If you get the other person talking about themselves or their experience, one, they like doing that and they like you for giving them that opportunity. And two, you can get some really good insight that you can leap off of. So the rule for chit chat and small talk is be interested, not interesting. And the rule for ending interviews with a question is get the other person talking, demonstrate your interest.
Yeah, I really, really like that. And actually, I've heard different people throughout my career suggest that, including, what is maybe the one weakness that stands out to you about myself on my resume or something. That also gives you information if you don't get that job to strengthen your resume or something like that in the future. So there are a lot of really good questions that you can use for figuring out if the company is for you, if the employer is for you, and also just for future job searching purposes. So I really like that question, Matt. If it's an office-based job, is sort of how you keep your employees engaged. Do you think that's a fair question now to basically say, listen, if I'm going to be home most of the time, how do I become part of this team, or what's the onboarding process like?
Completely. Yeah, I would say asking about the onboarding process, asking, what are the last few things you've done to interact with coworkers, maybe outside of a typical meeting and whatnot, and just see what kind of examples they come up with.
Yeah. And we have a comment here from Michael who says, I always ask what the greatest changes in the last year, coming year is for the company. So I think that's really interesting to say sort of, hey, listen, here's sort of a open-ended question for you and to see how the employer reacts.
So let's talk mindset first. And because I know a lot of people panic because they don't have a lot of time to ask questions. So when you get ready for an interview, you should categorize your questions basically into 4 buckets: company-specific questions, role-specific questions, boss-related questions, and then interviewer-related questions. So you want to make sure that you're categorizing those so that you can pick and choose the questions that you want to ask based on the interviewer you have. And then I want you to think of the interview process as one whole entity. And I want you to assume when you start that screen with the recruiter or HR person, I'm going to win this. I'm going to get the job, which means I have the entire interview process to get all my questions asked. The most important thing for you is to be organized in the way that you ask those questions and organized in your ability to actually know which questions to ask this particular interviewer. It's usually pretty easy to do. Most of the time, you have the interviewer's name or at least their function or maybe both. And if you don't, that's something that you should get early on in the process. And if you've written out your questions or typed them out or however you want to do that, when you get into the interview, prioritize the questions. And if you are dealing with somebody who can answer an array of those questions from those different groups I mentioned, you want to go from the top down. You want to ask corporate level questions first, then role, then boss, and so on. An interviewer, I mean, is there something specific to the interview? Don't sweat. If they only give you 5 minutes to ask the ones you can, prioritize them before you go in. And remember that you will have more time to ask more questions. So yes, no, I would definitely, I mean, we spend a lot of time on this stuff because you are interviewing them too. Just remember that, right? So you want to be buttoned up.
Yeah, and I think also what I take away is, you know, anyone who's ever interviewed anyone, I think often they take more from those questions they get asked than sometimes what the answers are in other parts of the interview. Thanks for watching. Some great advice there. Hope you found it useful and informative. If you're looking for additional guidance on your career journey, click the buttons on the screen to see the next video in the series, or watch the full-length episode for more tips. Both videos are also listed in the description below.